Good morning. You are a beautiful group. It is fantastic to see you. Although now that I can see you, I can also see that I share something with about maybe not even quite a third of you. Shade. You guys back there have shade. So this is a little bit of an unfair competition because I know you guys are going to want to get into the shade and I'm comfortable up here. So and I also now know there's a puppet over here. I've never been someplace that had a puppet at the podium. So what's my speech? It's not going to work. All right. Thank you, President Spencer. It's a privilege and honor to be here. And thank you to you, the entering class, for having spent time with my book this summer. And thank you as well to staff and faculty who have done so also and engaged on that. It is a true honor to share the first day of school with you. First days of school are joyous days. I don't have to tell any of you that. I'm a person who went to school at 4, and I've never left. So I love the first day of school. It is literally my favorite day of the year. And to be able to experience the first day at Bates College with such a noble history is a rare privilege itself. Rare history, I'm thinking of the fact, of course, that Bates was founded by abolitionists and therefore set itself apart in the middle of the 19th century when this country was racked with conflict over the question of human equality. There are not many places that share that status with Bates of having committed themselves from the get-go to a position of equality. This is important to me for many reasons, some of them having to do with the Declaration of Independence itself, because of course that's a text that we so often connect so closely to Thomas Jefferson that a very common view of the text is, isn't it all just hypocrisy? I mean, after all, Jefferson owned slaves, right? So wasn't it all just propaganda to foster a war effort, to drive people to fight the British without any really serious commitment to a genuine idea of human equality? And of course, the answer to that is that it wasn't just Jefferson. As President Spencer said, the Declaration is the product of democratic writing. John Adams, man of Massachusetts, never held slaves, thought slavery was a bad thing, was just as important to the text of the Declaration as Thomas Jefferson. And I won't take you through all the details of that fact at the moment. I articulate it now only to underscore the fact that the Declaration of Independence itself had many voices in it. And as a result of that, it actually spawned, it gave birth to many traditions. The tradition associated with Jefferson that became the tradition of the South and the tradition of the slave states, yes, but also the tradition of Adams and Massachusetts and the abolitionists. And the Declaration of Independence, in fact, was used immediately for the cause of abolition. African American in Boston, Prince Hall, quoted the Declaration December 1776 as he began to move forward making the case for abolition. Vermont, not yet a state, still its own country, think of that, Vermont its own country. 1777 was the first to abolish slavery. But Pennsylvania and Massachusetts weren't far behind. 1780 in Pennsylvania, 1780, 81, 82 in Massachusetts because of a combination of what Massachusetts did with its constitution and judicial decisions around the Constitution. And in each of those cases, they quoted the Declaration of Independence. So when somebody says to you, that Declaration of Independence, it's all about Thomas Jefferson, it's all about slavery, remember to say to them, not so, not so. It was, in fact, the beginning of the abolition movement. And in that regard, you, as members of the Bates community, are in some sense the direct heirs of the democratic writing achieved in 1776. Okay? But what I want to really talk about this morning is, in a funny way, less the Declaration, it'll be here consistently with us in my remarks, and more about the magic of the liberal arts classroom. Because that's what you're here for. That's why I wrote the book, actually. And that, weirdly enough, I can argue, is what the Declaration is about. So why exactly did I write the book? What got me started down this road? You know from reading the book that it was a very specific teaching experience. I taught in a night program for low-income adults in Chicago. Most of my students were African Americans, some Latinos, some poor white students, but all low-income, struggling to get by. They were trying to find a new way forward. They were people who had generally fallen out of the educational system, so quite different from yourselves and your own trajectories, and this was their chance. And the founding idea of the course was founded by a man named Earl Shorris. It was called a Clementi course. In Chicago, we called it the Odyssey Project, and there are versions of these all over the country at this point. The founding idea was that people living in poverty deserved the same quality of education as my day students at the University of Chicago were getting. The idea was that people living in poverty deserve the same quality of education as you, sitting here at Bates College, will get. And this is a challenging thing to achieve when you have students who come in without the kind of preparation that we expected from all of you in order for you to be admitted to Bates College. And so how exactly do you do that? We decided to focus on short, high-quality texts, hence the Declaration of Independence. No change in the quality bar for what we're going to be reading and discussing and talking about, just picking short ones. What really matters, so as I said, why did I write the book? The answer to that question lies in the fact of the first book that I wrote. So I wrote this book twice. Something to keep in mind when you're getting ready to submit a paper, okay? I wrote the whole book twice. And that doesn't count revisions and so forth in each version, okay? So the first book that I wrote was a dialogue. It was a conversation between teacher and students, teacher and 18 students. And I had invented a character who was the teacher, and the students were students from my class, but I had changed characteristics and so forth, and I developed a romance story between two of them to be a sort of through line through the narrative of this conversation. I was imagining the movie Rice. It was going to be a great movie about this amazing classroom experience. But the reason I wrote it this way, as a dialogue, was because of the magic of the experience of teaching these students. Every classroom that I've had has had this magic in it. And I'll tell you in a minute how I think about the magic, what I think it is. Every classroom I've taught has had that magic. But this one had it with a special intensity, and I was trying to capture it. And so what was that intensity? It came out especially in the conversations that I had with my students about the Declaration of Independence. Because my students, as it happened, to my surprise, had never read the Declaration of Independence. It was a text that neither they nor anybody who had taught them had ever thought of as relevant to them, all right? And yet, their lives were full of grievances. They had lots of things that were wrong in the world around them. And the Declaration is fundamentally, at its core, nothing other than a story about human agency. A group of people who look around and say, when in the course of human events, here's what's currently happening. Therefore, I'm going to make a decision about how to direct my life, and I'm going to justify it. That's the core of the Declaration. Diagnosing your circumstances, choosing a course, and justifying it. And every one of my students in that night class had just done that. The fact that they were sitting in that class meant that they had looked around their world, which was full of relatives in prison, people suffering from gunshot wounds, diabetes and other health crises, difficulty juggling jobs with supervisors who had little time or charity for the complexity of their lives, childcare situations that made it nearly impossible for them to combine the public transportation schedule with the childcare schedule, with the work schedule, and actually bring in enough money to put food on the table. They had looked around their lives and said, this is not acceptable. I need a change. And the change that they had settled on was education. And more specifically, the type of education they were choosing was yours. What each and every one of you will get for the next 4 years, which we too easily take for granted when college has always been where we were headed. So what is the nature of that education? Why was there this symbiosis between them their own course of agency in the Declaration with its story about agency. They went to the Declaration to its heart immediately. They understood it, understood its purposes, faster than any other students I had ever worked with. And so it's really the question then of how it is both that the liberal arts college classroom brings out that attentiveness to agency and what the Declaration can tell us about it. They got to the core of the text partly because what we were doing in the classroom was talking. And we were talking for the purpose of achieving understanding. Understanding of self, understanding of the text, and understanding of the world. And it was the effort to do those things together that was enabling them as agents. For them, this stood in contrast to another mode of education that they'd had, one where the purpose was always to give them the next technical qualification, maybe as a chef getting ready to cook in a restaurant, or maybe as a computer coder getting ready to be a piece of a team doing computer coding. The kind of education that they were used to tended to turn them into instruments. Okay, what does that mean exactly? It's when somebody has an idea, they want to train you to do some work that they think is good to have done. Okay, they've got a project, they want to run a restaurant, they want to build cars, pass the cars through a factory, and they want some people who can do a specific thing. And so they're going to train you to do that thing efficiently and well. And that is turning you into an instrument of somebody else's purposes. These students chose instead our classroom, our discussion-based classroom, because they had an instinct for the fact that it was about agency. Not somebody else's purposes, but finding your own and equipping yourself to meet them. And again, that was symbiotic with the content of the Declaration of Independence. So let me now just say a few words about how we learn about the concept of agency from the Declaration itself. The easiest way to do that is to turn again to that all-important second sentence. And yes, it's true, as President Spencer said, I turn the words over and over and over again and again and again. So we'll do it just one more time, all right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So let's just dwell for a moment on the phrase, as to them, you, all of you, shall seem most likely to affect your safety and happiness. Most likely. You can't get it right once and for all. All you can do is give it your best shot. That claim in the Declaration is about probabilistic judgment. It's what you think is most likely to give you a shot at safety and happiness. And it's on you to make those judgments. So the Declaration asks a big question. It says, okay, to be an agent, here's what agency looks like. You've got to diagnose your circumstances, you've got to prescribe a course of action, and you have to justify it. But in order to do that work of diagnosis, prescription, and justification, well, you have to come to a view as to what to you seems most likely to affect your safety and happiness. So how do you do that? How on earth do you do that? One answer, it's not the only answer, but one answer is a liberal arts education, okay? And so that's what these educations were built for. And the name liberal arts, of course, goes back to ancient Rome. Liberalis, the Roman Latin word for free. It was the education for free people. Free people are people who judge. They are agents. They are not the instruments of other people's purposes. They select their own purposes. They make probabilistic judgments about how best to realize their purposes. So the Declaration I would say, is among other things in joining us all to pursue the kind of education that you have offered to you here. So how exactly can a college campus like this equip us to make the kinds of large-scale judgments that the Declaration is talking about? Diagnosis, diagnosing our circumstances, of course, that's history, that's sociology, it's political science, it's literature, it's cultural studies. Literature, because we have to understand how human beings work. Cultural studies, because we have to understand how cultures work. History, sociology, the same thing. In order to diagnose your circumstances, you have to be able to look around your world, whether it's your small, local world of your campus community or the big world, and discover patterns. And we train our mind to see those patterns by training it on older materials, archives from other times and places. If I, trained as a classicist, can see patterns in ancient Greece, then I feel confident I can see patterns in my contemporary world. And so I do that. I look around and I say, oh, it's hot today. It's been hot a lot lately. And let me look at the science, and I learn how to pull in the evidence to take my own observations and tell a story about what's happening to myself and sort through the different arguments about it. This is something we have to pay attention to, the climate. Just thinking about the patterns in our world, patterns in history, already gives us access to the capacity for diagnosis. And what about prescription? Philosophy, literature again, because novels, poems are full of moral complexity. They give us examples, cases, other people working through the difficulty of figuring out what to do, how to live, what happens when people make mistakes, how do you recover from those mistakes. Art, music, all of those resources help us, equip us to answer the question of what we should do. How should I live singly? How should we live collectively? And then justification. Justification. You could say history, you could say philosophy, all of those things are relevant. But what really matters is conversation. Justification is about testing your reasons for doing things with the people around you. And so that is the other remarkable thing about a liberal arts college education. You could go off and get all of the history you want in a MOOC online. You could even get a heck of a lot of poetry online in a MOOC. But what you can't get is the opportunity to test the justifications for your choices, because that requires a set of relationships. And that's what the Declaration so beautifully embodies in the practice. So not only for the men in Congress in Philadelphia, but for all the communities up and down the Eastern Seaboard that were talking about the question of what they should do, coming up with their reasons for their choice to independence, and justifying it to one another in small town hall meetings that happen not only in Massachusetts, that's famous for that, but even in Georgia. Even in Georgia, people were gathering in farmers' fields and justifying to one another their choices. Okay? So that conversation is what we need for justification. And finally, to wrap it all up, after you've got the diagnosis, after you've got the prescription, after you've got the justification, in one sense or another, you need a declaration. And I don't mean by that that everybody's got to write a formal declaration for every time they decide to do anything. Like Berto's going to Luigi's, he's going to give us a declaration of, here's why I'm going to Luigi's today. We don't need that for absolutely everything. But the point is that when you decide to do something, you have your justification, you do need to present it, you need to argue for it, you need to persuade people of it. And so we need eloquence as well. That too comes from conversation. It also comes from, as Berto said, leadership opportunities. Trying to see whether you can, with words, persuade people of a course of action. So leadership is important for that reason too, because it's also where we get our lessons in eloquence. So this was the magic of the liberal arts classroom that I taught in with those night students. They got the story of agency immediately, and then they wanted to take the Declaration apart. They got that it was about diagnosis, about prescription, about justification, about declaration, and then they wanted to use it in their own lives. And they did. They did write declarations about Chicago, about the south side of Chicago. This was in the years coming up to the first election of President Obama, and that was inspiring to the students in my night classrooms. And so they also began to practice giving speeches, being leaders in public contexts. And it is a beautiful thing, finally to the magic, a beautiful thing, a rare human privilege to have the chance to see people coming into their full as agents, actors in the world, choosers of their own courses. So that is what a teacher gets. That is what the joy of teaching is fundamentally about. And while all of the faculty sitting here, greeting you today, welcoming you, have the best job in the world. So once again, it's a joyous day. Let there be magic in these classrooms for you. But remember, the source of the magic is you. Thank you.